Go ahead, Tom.
Okay, all right, everyone, let's start this. So anyway, this is why you got your last name and what you can find out about your family. And basically what we're doing is we're going to show you how to research what possible occupational meaning there might be in your name, but also where you can find your ancestors' occupations that are in a lot of different places. And we're going to look at it pretty much every single one of them. Anyway, so we use them, but how do we get them? And of course, we got them from our families, our father, grandfather, so on. But there's more to this story. Basically, most people's last names are broken down by the place of family origin, some sort of physical characteristic, an occupation, or a residence. And basically, most European surnames date back to the 12th to 14th centuries because society was getting much better organized. Things like taxes had to be recorded, sales had to be recorded, and also you had to prove that someone was 21. And so you had to know you were talking about the right person. And here's a few examples. Armstrong is a physical characteristic. Place of origin would be like the name Lombardo for Lombardy in Italy, and an occupation would be a shoemaker. And you know, when it translates to various different languages, like German is Schumacher, but it's still the same word. And here's the essential problem. John the butcher and John the baker, which one is which? Because you want to make sure when you send someone to the store, you want a loaf of bread, he's not bringing back a joint of lamb. A little fun here. What did Christopher and Keanu have in common? And this is what it was. Their last name, a Reeve or Reeves was an occupational name for steward or bailiff, and their duties varied quite a bit. But in general, they would patrol the Lord's lands. They would decide which ones would be planted, which ones would lie fallow, which places would be drained, and just sort of overall control. So it was a very important job. This is a really fun one. The surname, Bailey is a very common surname in America and Britain. And that was for, as you see here, the outer wall of a castle. And if you look at ruins all over Europe, you'll find that to some degree they're all built like that. And the thing is that these people actually lived there. They lived in like little huts beneath the walls. If you see movies like The Lion in Winter, they show Bailey and they show all these little huts and everything everybody's living in. And by medieval standards, life there wasn't too bad. You were close to work, so you didn't have to commute far. And but there's always a trade-off. And basically, there was an outer wall, the Bailey, and an inner wall for the fortress. And if an invading army basically got through into the Bailey, you were pretty much toast. And you know, a lot of people got their surnames because in the Middle Ages, this form of social stability, what everybody did was to actually require a son to follow in the occupation of his father. And so there would be generations, I mean, multiple generations all doing the same job. And so it was very far from a gig economy. And so that's why it's important to sort of learn what they did. It adds a whole dimension to your family history. And so we're going to learn about some other ways to find out what kind of things our ancestors did for a living. Now, the library has quite a few books, and one of them is called the Dictionary of Surnames. We have several different kinds of books where you can find out a lot of different names. And this is just one of them. But for instance, my great granduncle James married a Catherine Conroy, and in 1870, her father was listed as a carman, and it was actually someone who actually were transporting goods, like local stores and everything, because it was all done by horse and wagon originally, and so they also on horse-drawn trolleys. They were originally drawn by horses, and so they were also known as carmen. Now, a good place to start to find out, your ancestors' occupations is to look in the U.S. Census, because they pretty much have going all the way back, and they list the farmers and they list this thing and that thing, and you can sort of track everyone. Families had different occupations, so what they had in 1940 may not have been what they had in 1930 or 20 or going further back. So that'd be, like I said, a good place to look. Now here's right here is the New York State Census for 1915, and this is my great grandfather Daniel Marr, and his occupation was U.S. Army Sergeant, which is that exactly what he was. And his wife did housework, and their daughter Agnes was at school. Their son John was at school. Their daughter Monica was at school. So it's got occupations of some sort for the entire family. Now, you could also find a lot of information in what they call the non-population census, because between 1850 and 1880, they had a lot of information, and they had different census. They had a census for manufacturers. So if your ancestor owned a factory or, worked in one, you could possibly find them there. If they were owned a farm. This particular page is from a Georgia record for 1850, listing all of the livestock my great-great-grandfather actually had at that time. Another one is Social Security applications, and they actually do list, and this is for my grandmother, Agnes Marr Holder, and she worked at the Cypress Hill swimming pool, which is basically on the border between Brooklyn and Queens, and it's like way out there. It was about as far from where she lived as you could possibly get, but those were Depression days, so she definitely needed to get that job. And even though she worked in the swimming pool, it was definitely not as a lifeguard. Another thing is passenger lists. There's all sorts of things on databases like Ancestry that will list a lot of different things, and one of them is this is my great grandmother Agnes Casey, and if you look, it says on the card her occupation was a servant when she entered this country. And next week we'll be talking a little bit about the immigrant experience going through Ellis Island, and the servant occupation will have great import. So to tune in next week and see. Of course, naturalization documents have it too, and this is Daniel Marr again, and it says here he was 29, he was a soldier, and underneath his sponsor and witness to naturalization was his older brother James Marr, and that was his address, and he was a jeweler. So you can get a lot of information once you know where to find it. Now, of course, employee or union IDs are a great way of sort of figuring out what kinds of jobs people did. This particular one was a cadet nurse in a Massachusetts hospital in the 1940s. So that it tells you where she worked, which state, which dates, and quite a bit of information. Now, in some cases, if somebody worked for the federal government, if they were in sort of a supervisory position, they would actually publish these lists in the official register of the United States listing, all the employees, and you look on the side, you see who was the assistant secretary, who was the director of regulatory work. They had all these different classifications. So you might actually consider to try and find out if maybe someone in your family did work for the feds. Of course, city directories. And here's James again. He was a jeweler, and his home was 222 8th Street in Brooklyn, New York. And we'll get to that in a little later. So, and you can see them change, because if you follow the same person over a series of years, it's very, very possible that at some point they change their whole occupation entirely. But this is really interesting. Once you actually have the address, you can have a little fun with it, and I'll show you how to do it. You can actually look up the address on Google Maps. And so I looked up 222 8th Street, and here's the map in Brooklyn, New York, showing all these, like, here's Fifth Avenue, here's Fourth Avenue, here's 8th Street right here, and they tell you currently things that are around, like restaurants, barber shops, all sorts of things. But one of the things you can see is a close-up picture. And in the interest of complete disclosure, I have to tell you that 222 was actually here where the Catholic school now stands. However, the buildings adjacent to it are exactly what James and his family were living in. And actually, they did much better later on. They had another address which was a lot spiffier. Now, of course, draft registrations and the two world wars, a lot of people had to register the draft, not that they necessarily had to join the army, but they just had to register depending on your age. And actually, people who were, not in their 20s and 30s, they were known as the old man's draft. and they kept tabs on that just so that you might have some sort of occupation that the government might consider to be useful. So they would make a lot of people register. In fact, in World War I, out of 101 million people in the United States at the time, 25 million of them had to register. So that's a whopping, that's a quarter of the population right there. But like I say, if you go looking around, you'll see that it said he was, this is for my great uncle Preston Holder, and he actually was a farm laborer. Now, there are other records that can say it, like when my great grandfather Daniel joined the U.S. Army in 1888 for a 5-year hitch. It was a lot different then. He listed his occupation as a hostler, or one who cared for horses. So that fills in the picture, and of course that was very necessary then, because all the artillery, all the supplies, everything that had to be moved in the army then, artillery, everything had to be drawn by horses, and sometimes mules. In fact, sometimes I actually call that period in the United States as the Million Mule Army. Okay, another way is to just search the internet, and I did in Merriam-Webster. I found out that a hostler, a definition is one who takes care of horses or mules, and one who moves locomotives in and out of a roundhouse, or one who services locomotives. Well, he definitely didn't do anything with locomotives, so it was definitely the horses or mules. So we have a lot of people in my family who were somehow attached to horses, and to this day, my sister is a horse trainer, and so it's still there. Now, birth certificates, they always list the parents' occupations, And this is from 1963 from U.S. Army Tripler General Hospital. And of course, the information about the person who was born is all redacted. But the things that they left was his father was an officer and his mother was a school teacher, this girl, boy or girl. And I have to admit, I had quite a time finding this because usually in order to get something like this that didn't show too much information but what I needed, I found a lot of right-wing conspiracy sites that basically proved that President Obama was born anywhere between Hawaii and Mars. So took a lot of effort trying to get this. So I hope you appreciate it. Of course, death certificates. And this is for my grandfather who died in 1919. I was named for him. He was Thomas Quincy. I'm Thomas Quincy. And it said here he was a laborer. And that only tells part of the story. And he worked for R.J. Reynolds, which was no surprise because pretty much everyone in Winston-Salem did at that time. And but there's other ways to sort of get a little more information, and I'll show you. This is his death notice in the newspaper, and it describes that Mr. Wilcox was a machinist holding a responsible position with the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Factory, and where he's buried in Woodland Cemetery, it was actually given to the city by the R.J. Reynolds Company. And it's actually right across the street from the factory. So, you know, you just can't escape it. Now, this is one of the things you really got to watch out because as you see, sometimes you only get half the story in one document and you have to research further. But sometimes you get different descriptions of an occupation that you're not sure what exactly are they. It almost, in this case, we're going to go through, it actually sounds like the same person had 3 different jobs, but he only worked for one place. So this is what I had to do. And it was the detective story. This was my great-great-grandfather, James Marr, and he died in 1871. And I had 2 different records that described him as a clerk, a laborer, and a timekeeper. And I'm saying, she said, well, I sort of know what the clerk and the laborer part is, but what the hell is a timekeeper? So this is what I found. This was an index of people who were given letters of testamentary to settle an estate because John died without a will. So his widow was given the permission from the court to settle his estate, which they described as something around 200 pounds at the time. And it says that he was a clerk and a timekeeper. And so you sort of wonder, you know, what that was. And this is where I had to research even further. You know, I went back to the internet again, and basically, from what I've found, timekeepers were sort of what we would consider to be an office manager today, because I mean, watches were very expensive. Few people owned one. It was very common to see in prominent street corners in front of hotels and theaters, and they would actually put up their own clock. So when you're bopping around the street, you get an idea what time it was. So basically, he sort of kept everyone on schedule. So that's where the timekeeper thing came from. And the laborer was actually important because he worked for a grocer and corn grader. And so there was a certain amount of physical labor. And being the so-called foreman, he actually lived above the shop. He didn't own it, but he lived above it. So that was sort of a big perk. And that's where my great-grandfather Daniel was born. It was 49 Meat Street in Dublin in the Usher's Key ward. So you can find out an awful lot of stuff there. And this is his death certificate. This is the one that said he was a laborer. And I mean, there are other things you can find out, like he must have been a very strong man because he died of typhus fever. And he actually, according to this, lasted 8 days. And that's quite an achievement and for a 40-year-old man. So I'm just inferring he was quite strong. And but like I said, labor, it just doesn't really tell the whole story. What you also have to do is look at family photographs. A lot of people in families also got their pictures taken in uniform. And this is my grandfather, Delton Holder, my mother's father, and he was from here in Florida. And that's him in front of his Greyhound bus. It's exactly the same kind of bus that you see Ward Bond driving in It Happened One Night. He's even wearing the same uniform. And it looks sort of spiffy for a driver, but it really wasn't because the roads were very rough in the 20s and 30s. So you really needed those high boots and those jodhpurs to, really take care of anything. So it had to be a uniform that, people would recognize, but it also had to be very serviceable. Now, business and employer records, there's all these kinds of things that sometimes you can find employment files, which are not easy to get. It's easier to get your own, but there are some historical collections. Of course, newspaper articles. We already covered military records, historical societies, accident reports, pension lists, tax returns. And we'll get to the tax returns a little bit later. And here we are. We have the U.S. individual tax return for 1953 for my parents, Howard and Agnes Wilcox. And they were both still working. And basically, they made what they call about $10,000. And today, yeah, I mean, they actually made one of them made 1,084 and 37 cents, and that would be over $10,000 today. And that's below the U.S. poverty level. For a family of five, the poverty level is just over 30,000. So, and yet they managed. They bought a house when they were both working. They produced two children. My sister Lynn and I are on this form as dependents. My grandmother was living with us, and so they just managed. It was a lot cheaper to live then. Now I'll tell you, these are really, really hard to get. It's pretty easy to get your own. It's very hard to get others unless there's some sort of an estate settlement, something you need to do. So I was lucky enough to actually have these. I don't know why we kept them, but we have them. So I wouldn't use this as a main source, but if you have a chance to get one, it will really help you. And one of the fun things is to find your origins of your name. And there's a lot of different sites on the web. And I looked up my name, and the origin is from Will and Cock, meaning rooster. So no dirty thoughts here. And which signifies little Will's son. And one of them is Williamson. That's a variation, and it also indicates that they can be sort of obstinate, sort of like that. So that's a lot of fun. Another search is that some of them, like Genealogy Bank, they sort of do these general family histories, and they actually tell you which people, famous people, had the same name. And there's always the possibility that you may be related to them, but you can't just say, oh, I'm related to this prominent New York City politician in 1900 named Wilcox, because there are literally hundreds of thousands of people with your last name. So I be very careful, just sort of use as just sort of general interest. Another handy tip is that there are a lot of surname maps on the internet, and you can actually find out where your particular uh, surname was most common. And in this case, it's Ireland, and these are the counties where Mar, which is actually a derivation of Mager, actually were most used. Of course, the counties we came from aren't on this picture, but that's the way it goes. We can also help you with other cultures. And we have this one of our books called Hispanic Surnames and Family History. And that's really important because, like for instance, I mentioned World War I drafts. And, in the Southwest, where there were a lot of Hispanics at the time, people, the draft war people were mostly Anglos, and they didn't really understand that you could be Joseph, Ortega, Santos. And so sometimes they would just write down as Joseph Ortega and leave out the Santos or whatever else name. So you have to be a little careful, when you have to research that and just sort of play the probabilities, like, use other factors like location. If you knew they were in this particular town, then that's probably a good bet. That's the guy. But a book like this can really help. Right. Oops. Sorry, we have to go back. And all right. Now, I found this on the internet too, and they actually give you different languages. And for instance, barber in English, in French is coiffure, in German is friseur, in Italian is barbiere, and in Spanish is barbero, and in Swedish is barberare, and Polish is friser. So you can actually find a lot of different names because in some way or other, like for instance, it's easy if your name is in English. If you name something like Barber, you can sort of figure on that, or Carpenter. But when you go back to other places where they have different names in different languages, that can be a real issue. So there's a lot of things there that will definitely help you quite a bit. So this is actually the end of our little trip. But if anyone has any questions, I am definitely here. And so I'd like to hear from you. Thank you.
Hi, I don't have a question, but an interesting thing, you were talking about occupations on the census. The other day I was looking at a grandfather's, I think it was the 1920, and he was listed as a carpenter. By 1930, he owned his own carpentry shop. So you can see the evolution of how people live the American dream.
Oh, yeah.
And my name in Polish is Top of the Boot. And I never thought, you've given me some ideas of how to look what that meant. We thought, well, he's a bootmaker, but then we were told it had to do something with military guards, that position in the military, so I'm going to look that up now. It's interesting. Thank you so much.
Good, because that's important. You know why? Because, like, for instance, the grenadiers in the military, they all had to be 6 foot and no shorter than that, because their job was to lob grenades. And of course, a tall man could do it better than a shorter man.
Right. It just kind of fills out your life, your history.
Yeah.
Interesting facts. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay. So are there any questions, observations? I mean, it's even okay to tell me that I stink.
Never.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Well, that just about, wraps everything up. So we're going to stop sharing the screen, and I hope everyone has a great day. And if you ever have any questions or anything, just call the library and ask for me, and we'll try to help out. And I can even give you my professional email address, and it's Tom.Wilcox, Wilcox, and it's at Leesburg, Florida, and it's all spelled out, all one word, Leesburg, Florida, .gov, G-O-V, like in Gary, Oscar, Vincent. So if you don't call, you can always email me and I'll try to help you out.
Thank you
So,
so much.
all right,
Have a
thank
nice
you.
day.
You too. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.